We're going to be talking about Abraham tonight. And to start with, I need to go through some terms that would help you understand what we're going to be talking about. And the first one, and the easiest, is called a tell. Okay? And what you see behind you here, that is a tell. That is Tel Hatzor. And I was standing on it. Anyways, I was actually standing all over it. But a tell, if you want to picture it in your mind, is a multi-layered cake. Okay? It's like a wedding cake. And the further you go down, the older things are that you see. And so as archaeologists dig, of course, they start at the top, but then they keep cutting away layers. And literally what they do, and you'll see it when we talk about Jericho and things, is they take a piece of the pie out. And they pull that section out and they work it down and they go all the way until they get to bedrock. And bedrock is, there's nothing else there. But what they used to do is every time a civilization got wiped out, the winners would level everything off and put their houses on it. And then they'd get wiped out and everything. They'd level it off. And that's exactly what took place here at this Tel Hatzor. It looks like a mountain, but literally, you can, as you cut down, you're going to see 4,000 years of human history. It's just incredible. We think of the United States being 200 years old, and, that's old, but it's nothing compared to 4,000 years of history. The next one is carbon dating. And you want to be careful with carbon dating because to about 5,700 years old, and carbon dating gets terribly unreliable. And even less than that, when it gets to 4,000 years, 3,000 years old, it's very difficult. It's within, probability of 150 years. It's fairly inaccurate, but they do use it to be able to date things. Artifacts is a basic, you kind of understand that. That is human objects, things that we make that we have impacted the world around us. And when you find those, whether it's pottery or jewelry, kind of like stuff you see over there, that's artifacts. And that's what they're looking for, to tell who lived there and how they lived and what their customs were. Another one, and this one's kind of it's a pet peeve of mine every time I see it. You see how it says BCE? It's literally the same thing as when you say BC. What it is, there's a bunch of people that don't like the name of Christ, and they don't want to put it in anything. And so what they did years ago is they started saying before the Common Era. Now, BC is, of course, before Christ. Well, now they change it a little bit, so they don't have to say Christ in it. They'll say Common Era. And the same thing that you see with CE, they call it now Common Era instead of Anno Domini, which is the Latin for in the year of our Lord. That's what we say AD. Well, the idea is they just want to be able to take Christ out of it. Next, if I can find my notes, is the Bronze Age, and I'm going to just briefly mention it here. Bronze Age goes from, and the dates vary depending on the area, from 3300 BC to 1200 BC. Iron Age goes from 1200 BC to 586 BC. And then what we would call antiquity goes from somewhere around 586 when the Babylonian captivity took place through to 476 AD when Rome fell. Antiquity covers the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, it covers the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, it's all kind of classified in together. But just so you get an idea, these are the layers of which we're talking about. Bronze Age, simple and easy. Bronze, copper was easier to mold into things that you needed, tools, weapons, whatever. When they started using that, that's what they call Bronze Age. Iron Age is when they figured out how to make iron, if you believe the narrative, when they figured out how to make iron, and they could make stronger tools, stronger weapons. Anyways, and that's when you move into the next age. And then, of course, the Antiquities age is under the massive amount of activity of the Romans and the Greeks taking over the world, etc. Now, there's one other one that's really neat. It's called geomagnetic dating. And this is amazing. So, apparently, as iron moves around in magma form inside the earth, it changes our poles, north and south pole. It moves them around. Well, apparently that's trackable. What's really interesting, and they've only found it in the last few years, is when you bake a piece of pottery at high temperatures, it records where the poles are at that time. And they can use them almost as compasses to direct where the poles were at. Now, what's unique, what's interesting about that and what helps archaeology is you can take this piece from this location and this piece from this location, and if they all have the same magnetic pole, you know they were made at the same time. And it's a new way of being able to record dating that makes huge and will make huge impacts in archaeology in general, but also in biblical archaeology particularly, which that's where I love to go. So those are just different terms as we go through that they're interesting. Here's some thoughts before we move on and get into the interesting stuff. Archaeology does not prove or disprove the Bible. Archaeology is just what they find. It may help you understand your scriptures better, and it may solidify your ideas of the scripture, but it doesn't prove or disprove. Because you may dig something out that the dog buried last week, and it doesn't mean the same thing, right? Okay? Also, as Christians, we are accused of being biased, and that we warp our archaeological finds to our faith and belief. Well, that's probably true. We all have our own bents, and we have our own biases. But the atheists do too. And the secular archaeologists do too. And they are going to have a mindset, and they are going to base their ideas, and this is going to come huge into play when we come into Jericho, talking about Jericho. You get something set in your mind, and you're not going to see anything else other than that. And if you're not going to be honest about it, you're going to avoid some of the more telling that would go against your idea, you know. Repeatedly, archaeology confirms the Bible record. The Bible, as much as it is a spiritual book, it is a historical book. And there have been many people, many major discoveries, of which we will talk about, where men have opened up the scriptures and said, well, if this says this, then it should be in this area, and they find it to be true. A lack of artifacts also does not mean the Bible is not true, or that it didn't happen. Often in secular archaeology, they're going to say, well, we don't have any proof for it, so it didn't happen. Well, that's false. How many of you have heard of Napoleon? He was around in 1799, okay, so 200 years, 300 years ago, right? We have no archaeological proof that Napoleon was in Israel, that he walked in Israel. But we all know that he did from the historical record, oral tradition and text tradition. We have no archaeological evidence that he was there, but we know that he was. Same thing goes for Abraham. We have no, at this time, we have no solidified archaeological evidence that Abraham lived in Israel. But I'll tell you what, I just read an article as I was studying for these. It was pretty interesting. And we'll read some of the names that they find and that they have found in historical records. But Abraham's name has not been there. But it at least proves that the scriptures were being true to the historical event. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, just because we don't have the artifacts doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And as Christians, we don't want to take the artifacts that we find and push them to a narrative that's not true. We don't want to make a form of an idea by fitting our ideas in it when they're not true. That's what the secularists do. Okay? We're not going to do that because we don't need to. The Bible can stand alone as true all by itself. Amen? All right. Now, this before you is my rendition of a tell. And this will give you an idea. You saw Hatzor. You saw the big mound, the mountain. You have layers. Each layer gets progressively younger and younger. The bottom layer that we are going to be talking about tonight is Abraham. That's 2000 BC. 4,000 years ago. I'll tell you what, where we went in this trip, I would have paid the whole trip to go to this one place. Now, I hate to throw out my favorite spot in the first one, but that's just the way it happened because it is the oldest. And that's what I love about it. It's the oldest. 4,000 years old. It's beyond comprehension that God would preserve, and He did preserve it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. He preserved it so that we could find it in our day. So that those that do not believe have evidence that they could believe or that they are without excuse. Okay? But this is a tell. And like I said, you see my little guy here. I think he's cute. You probably can't see him from here. But we'll be taking him, as we go up, we'll be digging in opposite order of what the archaeologists do going back in time. So we're going to be dealing with the Bronze Age. We're going to be dealing with the Abrahamic layer. And we'll talk more about those others as we get to them. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Tonight, we are going to be studying God's covenant with Abraham. This is foundational for the Jewish faith and for ours. And we're going all the way back to Genesis chapter 11. That's a long way back in the Bible. Genesis chapter 11. Now, as I said, there's no direct archaeological evidence that says Abraham's name. But there's archaeological evidence that names people all over the place. So, make sure. One of these, sorry, you're supposed to see those. One of these days I'm going to have my computer fixed so you can see it all at once. When they get the parts in. Woohoo, let's hope. Genesis chapter 11, verse 28. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in the Ur of the Chaldees. Now I have a little sign here. If you can't read it, it says, therefore the children of Dan, went up to fight against Leshem. This is a sign, and you will find, they found a rock, is essentially what it was. A stele is what they called them, that had the story of the people of Dan not being settled in the land that they were at in Judges, and they couldn't take the land, so they decided to go up to Leshem, and they went up to this town, Leshem, who were peaceful people but lived apart from everybody else. They went up there and they killed them all and then took their land. And by the way, the tribe of Dan was the first one to go because of how evil they were. They were the first ones to go when the enemy started coming into battle. And we'll talk about that when it comes into time. But I want you to see this little place, Leshem. Verse 29 of chapter 11. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, and the father of Haran, and the father of Milcah, and the father of Ishka. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family, and to your father's house, to a land that I will show you. Sorry. Trying to keep up with two of them at once. This is a map. Down here is Ur of the Chaldees. This is where Abraham was from. He travels to Haran, where his family was from. His father dies here, his father Terah, and God tells him, now I want you to continue to go to the land where I've promised. Now down here, this is Jerusalem. There's Gaza, Bethlehem. There's Jericho. Up here is Tyre and Sidon, if you remember the stories with with Jesus. Now, in this other map over here, this is a blown up area of the Promised Land. Right here is Tyre. Next to it is Kadesh to the north, Hazor to the south, and right here is this little town called Dan. Now, when Leshem was defeated by Dan, Dan wiped them all out, took everything they had, built their own city on top of it, and they changed the name from Leshem to Dan. And you find that in the scriptures. And you're like, okay, so what's the big deal? Hold on. It gets really good. So this is the town of Dan, city of Dan. It was a major thoroughfare going north and south. Notice it's on the east side, the west side of the Jordan. If you were going here and you were coming from the north, you passed through either the coast, Tyre and Sidon, or you passed through Kadesh, Dan, and then Hazor. Okay? Notice where Abraham is going. Haran, and he's coming down here. Where this is where he's going. He had to go to the west side of the Jordan River. Now, this is actually right here at Dan. This is the headwaters, and I've got some beautiful pictures of the waters that come down off the mountain that feed the Jordan River and then all the way down into the Dead Sea. If Abraham was going to go, he was going through here. Okay? This gets cool. This is a gate that they uncovered from Leshem, or Dan, 4,000 years ago. This was the time of Abraham. Now, unfortunately, they had it all fenced off, but if you walk up next to it, it's a huge gate. It had 80,000 tons of stone and mud brick. It was 23 feet high with 2 towers. 50 courses of bricks were used just to preserve the gate. Now, what had happened, the reason we found it, or they found it, I'm not included in that, was because they had this great gate. It was stacked up really nice and tall, but then they wanted to build on top of it. So they took even the gate itself. This is the oldest preserved archway in the world, or at least it was when they found it. I think there's one that's older, but it was not completed. The reason it's completed and still standing is because they wanted to build on top of it, so they stuffed a bunch of rocks and mud in there and jammed it in there like a foundation, and then they built another tower and another wall on top of it. Well, what it did is it ended up preserving it. Now, these are mud bricks, and so they fall apart very quickly in weather. And so they built this massive arch over the top of it so that the weather can't get to it. But it is very possible. Some say that this was only just after Abraham's time, but regardless, whether it was Abraham's walking through this gate, this pathway to go into that city, invariably Abraham walked that path, him and Sarai. Now think about that. 4,000 years ago, and God has people preserve a building that makes no sense to anybody else. But 2000 AD, as we're reading through our stories in Genesis, and God says, oh yeah, this right here, the Bible's true. It's been true and it'll stay true. And here's some facts for it. Okay, here's what it would have looked like, this gate, and this is little people. There's a little donkey and there's a person. It had 2 towers on it, but here, what they did is they built rock, and then they built this on top of it, and then they built a slope for its foundation. It still, above the ground here, stood 23 feet high. It was a massive gate to have to attack. And what did Dan do? Well, he just kind of walked through and, hey, we're all friends, and then they killed everybody off. Like I said, we'll talk about them when we get there. Now I want to take you, now that I've told you about this place, and that Abram would have had to go through it to make it down to the Promised Land. Now I want to take you to another story in the Bible, to the Battle of Siddim. Genesis chapter 14, and it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, the king of Shinar, Arioch, the king of Elasar, and Chedorlaomer the king of Elam, and Tidal the king of nations, that they made war with Bera king of Sodom, Bersha king of Gomorrah, Shibna the king of Admah, Shember the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, and that is Zoar. And I meant to put a picture of Zoar from Masada. There's a picture I just got today, being on top of Masada looking down at the city of Zoar that's mentioned here. All of these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. Then they took all of the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of the provisions, and they went their way. Verse 12, and they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, his nephew, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Bad move. Bad move on their part. They could have left everything else, but they didn't. They took Lot with them. Verse 14, now when Abram heard that his brother, his nephew, was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants. He had his own army. He was a well-to-do man. He took his own army, who were born into his house, and went to pursue them as far as... Oh, where'd it go? I didn't change it. I'm sorry. My goodness. As far as Dan. That gate that I just showed you. He chased them, and I showed you the map. It's a long way to be on foot. He chased them from the bottom of the Salt, by the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea. He chased them from there all the way to the top of where the Jordan River starts. It was a long way, but they took them to that gate, okay, to that city. But it gets better. So he brought back all of the goods, and also brought back his brother, Lot, with his goods, as well as the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheba, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. By the way, you may not recognize the name Chedorlaomer, but you might recognize the name Hannibal. Not Hannibal. I just lost his name. The one that made the laws. It was Hannibal. Not Hannibal. Why in the world can I get that out of my head? I should have had it in my notes. Hammurabi. Thank you. There it goes. You may have heard of Hammurabi and his laws. That's Chedorlaomer. Many believe that is the same man. And again, it doesn't say Abraham specifically, but we have lots of historical records about these other people that are here. Now, let's continue. Verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. And you remember back last year, we talked about what the bread and wine mean all through the scriptures and how they apply to us and what they do for us. And it goes all the way to Christ in the Last Supper. So Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. We'll get into that in a second. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. Remember, I was talking about Wednesday night that we would be discussing this. There's tithing, whether you like it or not. So now, I want to take you to Jerusalem. As you go to Jerusalem, you often think of the Temple Mount. You go to the south of the Temple Mount, and that's called the City of David. That's where David lived. That was the location that he took because they said that he couldn't. He made his palace in the city of David. I've been there, and I will show you pictures at some point. You literally walk out from his palace on the other side of the city wall, and you look down, and you see an odd structure. In fact, they have almost completed, and I do believe they've completed the archaeology on this site, but the other parts of that site are just incredible, and they're not done yet, and I'll explain that in a while. But we just talked about Melchizedek, who is the king and the priest. When you go directly out from David's location, David's palace, outside the wall, you come to this place that is preserved perfectly. Okay? As of stone, it's preserved perfectly. What happened? Hezekiah, the king, he decided to do religious and not political, like military changes. Okay, he did a lot to change what they believed and how they worshipped, but then he also changed where the city wall was, and he put it on top of this place. But what happened was when they went to destroy this place, they said, "Oh no, this is a holy site. We can't destroy it. This is a place where God dwells." So they packed it, like we had talked about with them packing the gate up in Leshem and Dan. They packed this with rock and mud to preserve it. This is all literally carved out of stone, solid stone. And then what you see here, this is where they were all packing it in and trying to preserve it. They didn't want, if the pagans took over, they didn't want the pagans to get here. And so they built the wall on top of this location, this holy place. They took very special care that it would not be destroyed. And 2,800 years later, they're digging around, and guess what they find? This holy place. During David's time, was there a temple? No. The tabernacle was in Shiloh. It was not a place that was close to him where he could worship. He would have to travel and then come back, and he did that, but he didn't do it often. He went downstairs. This is the place where David would come and worship. In this hole, number 2 that you see here, this is a better picture of it. That's in the dark. That is a library. And they found all kinds of preserved jars. And by the way, if you'd like the article on this, I've got it for you. You can find it on the internet, and I'll give it to you. They found all kinds of completely compact jars. Particularly they tried to take care of them. Okay? And they found it in this library. It's a very distinct possibility that you see these little rocks right here. David sat down in his quiet time. And as he was praying to the Lord, he was writing out Psalms, like Psalm 23. I'll tell you what, it was a real special place to step down into this location. From the time of Abraham, to see how they once worshipped, but to see how God had preserved it for 4,000 years. It was still in use while David was king. Now, once they built the temple, they didn't need it anymore. Some believe that they still used it, but regardless, isn't that amazing? During David's time, they didn't need it. So anyways, all right, I'll continue. This is room 1, and that's the library. This is a grain where they would grind up grain for making bread, for sacrifices, etc. And let me see if there's anything else. Nope, I don't think so. This is also room 1. This is now looking down at the floor. These V's, they're not exactly sure what they are, but they think, their best guess is that is where they would prepare the animal for the sacrifice. This is like where you'd put the feet of the table in the ground to hold the table up, and then you'd do the sacrifices. You'd cut up the animal. And right here, this hole goes into the next room, and it's where they would tie the sacrifice off, like on a leash, they would tie it off so that they could do the sacrifice. And this is a door here going into the next room. And that fire extinguisher is not 4,000 years old, just in case you questioned. Where did my room 2 go? Come on. All right, Genesis chapter 28, verse 10. Now Jacob, we're talking about Abraham's grandson, went out from Beersheba and he went towards Haran. He's going back to where Abram left, right, to go find family, get married. Verse 11 through 15. Jacob goes to sleep and he dreams about a ladder that goes to heaven, right? Then God promises to be with Jacob and bless him. That says verses 11 through 15, my paraphrase. Verse 16, then Jacob awoke from his sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. And this is the gate, to heaven. Then Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put at his head and set it up as a pillar. He poured oil on top of it, and he called the name of that place Bethel. But the name of that city had been Luz previously. Now Bethel, if you know your Hebrew, Bet is house. El is God. El Shaddai and all the others. So it's literally what he says here in verse 17. This is the Bet, the house of God. So what he does when he believes it's the house of God is he takes the stone that he used for his pillow and he sets it up to stand up, and he pours oil over it and anoints it. Now he comes back to this place because of a prophecy that God gave him here, but I want you to get what he's doing here. Because when you go into room 2 of this place, you see a man-made box, and they made this box to preserve what they found inside. What they found inside was this rock that was packed with dirt around it and stones around it to keep it upright. Now, why would you put a stone? You'd take it and you'd put a stone and put it standing straight up. Because that was the tradition of the people back then. Because this was the house of God. Not any God, God Most High. This is where Melchizedek did the sacrifices and the prayers. He would pour oil over top of this rock because this was the house of God. Room 3, this is where they would have the sacrifices, here and here. And this is an up-close view. And then here, you can see this is the blood drain, where the animals would bleed out. That the blood would run down this channel and then across to the far side out on the ground. But this is where the animals would lay. And pretty sure some say that this was just for ventilation, but I'm almost sure that this is where the sacrifices were burned, because you can even see some of the stones discolored, and in person it looked a whole lot more like that. So you think about it, for 2,000 years, there were sacrifices that were being burned. And like I said, this is all, you can almost see the etch work, how they cut in the stone. It's wild, but it was all solid stone, and 4,000 years ago, to make a massive temple. That's room 3. Then you go to the next room, and this down here on the floor, this is an olive press. It doesn't take much olive oil. They didn't need much olive oil because it was for sacrifices. It was for purification. And so they did just a little bit, and there would be a pole that would sit in here, come down, and it would crush the olives. In the back side here, that was a like a storage room that they kept. Anyways, to stand, I would have seriously, if I had to pay the entire amount that I paid to go to Israel, to just see this room, I'd have done it. This is the place, the house of God, for over 4,000 years. And God preserved it so that we could see Melchizedek. Now, why do you say, what's so big about Melchizedek? Oh, and let me connect this really quick. Psalm 76, verse 2. In Salem also is his tabernacle, and his dwelling place is in Zion. Zion is a hill in Jerusalem. Salem was where Melchizedek was priest and king. After David took it, they ended up, the Jebusites lived there, and then David took it from the Jebusites, but it became Jerusalem. And that's the place that we know as Jerusalem. This just confirms that this is where Melchizedek did his sacrifices. And here's the 4 rooms. If you could look down on top of it. Now, right now, they've got this massive floor to protect it that they've built up with pillars and all. But this is it. And it was incredible to know that Melchizedek, 4,000 years ago, had been giving sacrifices, and he had spoken to Abraham and done sacrifices with Abraham. Here is a man named Leshem. He is the archaeologist that found this location. And here he's holding up a picture of what they call as a bulla. And a bulla is something, it's a very small token. But what's interesting about it, on this bulla, it talks about Bethlehem. Now, you say, well, it's Jerusalem. Bethlehem's only a few miles away. But remember, David's palace was right on top of the hill. It connects Abraham, Melchizedek, David, Bethlehem, all in this one place. And I'll show you in a minute, there's a bunch of pottery that he found that was from Abraham's time in that library and also in the storage room. Leshem, this is from Wikipedia. He's an archaeologist employed by the Israel Antiquities. He's made several significant finds in the period of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. In 2004, Shikron and archaeologist Ronnie Reich excavated the Second Temple period Pool of Siloam, and we got to stand there, and I will show you pictures. And they just announced it 2 weeks ago that they are going to expand it by massive. And it's huge for biblical archaeology, particularly pertaining to the time of Christ. And like I said, when we get there, I'll show you. But he found the Pool of Siloam. In 2007, he and Reich excavated ancient Jerusalem water tunnel that drained Jerusalem, and that's Hezekiah's tunnel. Like I said, Hezekiah made a bunch of reforms of religious and military, and one of them, he made this massive miracle of a tunnel. Through solid bedrock, 3/4 of a mile, he had one group of guys start, and on the other side of the mountain, another group of guys start, and just work towards each other, and they met in the middle. No amazing, science and all of that. Not back then. It was a miracle of God. And we walked through it. I've got pictures. But it's windy. And you say, how in the world could they have found themselves in the middle of this mountain? And God brought them together to save Israel. To save Jerusalem particularly. Shukran, anyways, he found it. In 2009, they uncovered the Pilgrim Road, and this was where pilgrims they would go and wash themselves in the Pool of Siloam, and then they would go worship at the temple. Well, finding the Pool of Siloam is amazing, because if you wanted to go to the temple to worship, you had to go and wash yourself in a mikvah, this massive mikvah. And they went up this road that was straight there. Well, if that's the case, all of the first century church worshiped there, including Jesus. And you can literally, and we did, walk on the exact same road that Jesus went to go to the temple. It was incredible. May of 2014, Shukran claimed to have discovered the legendary Citadel of David, and that is since to be proven true, and we walked through that. Like I said, it's just above Melchizedek's temple. And in December of 22, he announced that together with Gershon Gali, that he had discovered a summary inscription in the Shalom tunnel recording the deeds of Hezekiah, including the cutting of the tunnel and giving date when it was completed. And like I said, I got to walk through that. It was pretty amazing. These are some of the pottery, and it's rather extensive pottery, that they found from Abraham's time period, and then of course that's the bulla that mentions Bethlehem, David's home. Now this is, where'd it go? This is what they believe, some believe, Melchizedek's temple would have looked like with the 4 different rooms. And then this would have been the city of Salem on the other side. But anyways, that way you can get an idea of what it would have looked like. And up here would have been, this has been the city of David, and up further yet would have been the Temple Mount and the rest of Jerusalem. Next week, I want to show you and talk about these 2 rocks. It's actually the same rock. The one side doesn't look burned at all. Doesn't look charred. Looks like a normal rock. But on the other side, it is completely black. And I took this picture holding it in my hand, and I was shaking as I did. And we'll talk about that one next week. But before we go, I want to apply this to our lives. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And we can stop there for now. Well, no, let's read Sarah as well. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And this is where I'd like to make it personal. Seeing these things and experiencing them, they're amazing. And I'm going to tell you, if you get the opportunity, you need to go. It's worth it. I've said it over and over again. If you had to walk to work, save up the gas money to pay for the trip, it would be worth it. There's a lot of people out there that have gone and it's changed their life, and I'm one of them. But more than that, this is where I want to make it personal. If all you can ever see it is in words and in print and in pictures, Abraham never saw it at all. God says, I've got something for you. I've got an inheritance for you and your children, and I'm going to bless you. But you have to obey. And look at that. It says, not knowing where he was going, by faith dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents. Never owning a single stable place for him to live. The only thing Abraham owned in that was the cave of Machpelah, where they buried his wife Sarah and himself. That was it. But he lived in faith that God was going to do what he promised. He said, I'm going to bless the entire world because of you. Can we imagine? I mean, could Abraham imagine? And I think he had some kind of inkling, but could Abraham even have imagined that the Messiah would come through his line? That he would be considered a friend of God? What is God calling of you? What promise has he given to you? Has he given you a promise? If he hasn't, start asking. But if he's given you a promise, if he's given you something, time to just go out and live it. And know that him, the person that she judged the person to be faithful who had given the promise. There is no telling. The promise that he has given you, there is no telling how great it could really be for you and your family. Abraham gave it all up. He had security, he had family, he had everything he needed in Haran to live and survive. But it was not the promise of God. Are you living in that promise? This is why it's personal to me. Because there are promises that God has given me that have not yet been fulfilled in my life. And I'm holding on for dear life. And there's been many times when the devil has told me, oh no, you're past the age, it's too late, you're too far gone, you're not smart enough, whatever. He's given me all kinds of lies about those promises. But if he could promise to Abraham, who didn't have a son, that through his son all the world would be blessed. If he could promise to Sarah, who laughed when she heard about it, if he could do that with them, he can do that with every single one of us sitting here. He keeps his promise. And then he preserves the proof of it for 4,000 years. So that we can know Yep, it's true. Let's pray.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.